Right, so great to be here for my first presidential address. I tried to work out when I first joined the Kent Field Club. I think it was about 1985 when I first started working at the former Tunbridge Wells Museum. So just a word of introduction. What I'm sharing with you this afternoon is based on some research that I did for the Amelia, the new all singing, all dancing Tunbridge Wells Museum Library and an education and art gallery all coming together in one building. So if you've never actually visited us, do come and see what we've done with the old place. We opened the 28th of April this year, though it seems like we've been open forever. And anyone who remembers the old building will see there's a great transformation has taken place. So this talk looks some sector of the past to the heritage of conservation in Tunbridge Wells, local history, natural history crossover. And then next year, unless I radically changed my mind, next year, the idea is to bring the story up to date and to tell you more about invertebrate conservation in the Tunbridge Wells area, particularly our urban open spaces, which we're talking about the origins of this afternoon. This is the earliest score of Tunbridge Wells, and more about that later. So Tunbridge Wells is unusual among the larger towns of South East England in that it has no ancient foundation, didn't have a sort of medieval mayor and corporation and so on. Located in what was once a remote area of the High Weald at the intersection of three rural parishes, Tunbridge, Frant and Speldhurst, the site of present-day Tunbridge Wells barely registers in historical records before about 1600s. Very sparse documentary sources from the medieval and Tudor periods show us a wild, rocky landscape dominated by heathland and woodland, with scattered farmsteads and tiny settlements with only a very sparse population. There's a quotable quote from Lord Burleigh, who accompanied Elizabeth I on her progress through the Weald in 1573, staying at Lord Abergavenny's seat at nearby Erridge. And Lord Burleigh wrote that the Queen's Majesty had a hard beginning of her progress of the Weald of Kent and Sussex, where surely are more wondrous rocks and valleys and much worse ground than in the peak, as is evoked by this early 1700s watercolour of the High Rocks. And that quote by Lord Burleigh evokes a landscape full of natural wonders, but at the same time, a place that was difficult of access and that no one was likely to visit from choice. And those difficulties of access remained until the start of modern road building in the 1800s. But as time went on, they became part of the mystique of the place. Only 30 miles from London as the crow flies, but seemingly belonging to a very different, less developed world. And that shift in attitudes is partly the development of romanticism, people coming to appreciate wild as well as tame landscapes, but more specifically, it stems from the discovery in 1606 by Dudley Lord North of the Cliviot Spring, the iron-bearing spring with supposed wonderful health-giving properties, which you can still see on the pantiles in Tunbridge Wells today. The young courtier, Lord North, claimed to have been saved from, quote, sinking into an early grave by drinking the spring waters while convalescing at Lord Abergavenny's seat at Erridge. Not only did he, his doctors told him to go out there and get out to the countryside and get himself fit again, but he found that not only did he not get better, but he also got bored and depressed. And so the story goes that he was on the brink of returning to London with a view that if I've got to die young, I might as well die happy. And then he saw this spring emitting orange-coloured water, which he knew was iron-bearing, and there was a a spa in present-day Belgium that was resorted to for its health-giving properties, and so we thought maybe I found England's answer to spa. And so Lord North promoted the wonderful properties of the chalybeate spring far and wide among elite circles, and that led to an increasing flow of visitors pursuing what later Georgian writers would describe as a secular version of pilgrimage. No holy well this with supernatural properties, but a scientifically verified health resort. And the early Georgian guides to Tunbridge Wells say this quite explicitly. If this had been discovered in the medieval era, it would have been attributed to the patronage of some saint. But we're in the Enlightenment now, and so we have our own secular foundation myth for Tunbridge Wells. Queen Henrietta Maria visited in 1630 and placed the royal seal of approval on England's new spa, and contributed to the foundation myth of Royal Tunbridge Wells, although we didn't actually get that title until 1909. And it was only 2 years after the Queen's visit that Dr. Ludwig Rousey published The Queen's Wells, the earliest treatise on Tunbridge Wells. The later histories of Tunbridge Wells in the 1700s and early 1800s lovingly retell these early stories, and they emphasize this idea of Tunbridge Wells as terra incognita, an unknown land, as if it was the discovery and exploration of some new territory overseas or in a different dimension. Thomas Bench-Burr's pioneering history of Tunbridge Wells in 1766 vividly describes Lord North's sojourn in, quote, one of the most savage parts of the county of Sussex, which by its distance from all neighbourhood secluded its inhabitants from all intercourse with the rest of mankind. And this is the Sussex heathlands of Broadwater Forest as they were in the 1800s. And this is an area that is now preserved as the RSPB Broadwater Warren Reserve. The county boundary sort of it's always secured the open country to the south of Tunbridge Wells from further development. Tunbridge Wells always tended to grow sort of, you know, east and north into Kent, but not ever so much into Sussex. The influx of well-to-do visitors who commonly stayed for extended period. These were no, you know, short breaks, you know, couple of weekend, couple of weeks. They stayed often for you know, weeks and months on end. So the influx of visitors brought a radical change to the existing rural economy. And local landowners and small farmers and tradespeople capitalised on the new source of income by offering accommodation and services, and they developed the beginnings of the tourist industry. The only precedent was faraway Spa on the continent. They were really making it up as they went along. But over time, they created England's first holiday resort. This, in the late 1700s, shows the entry to Tunbridge Wells from London. And those who are familiar with Tunbridge Wells can still recognise this scene today. This is that triangular bit of the common where London Road and Mount Evelyn meet. And you can still see the little cottages nestling in the rocks today. Oh, and that thing, strange thing there is a very form of street lighting, an oil lamp. Yeah, so I had to go around and fill them up and light them every day. So by the end of the 1600s, we have this. This is Jan Kitt's bird's eye view of Tunbridge Wells, about 1700. About 40 years older than the earliest map, earliest detailed map, which I'll show you in a bit. So it doubles up as a topographical survey of Tunbridge Wells. And you can see the walks, later the pantiles, which provided shops and other facilities for the visitors. one of the first places where shopping became a leisure activity. You can see the little stream that at that point marks the county boundary there. And over to the left, the open expanse of Tunbridge Wells Common, which, as we shall see, was maintained as a sacrosanct open space by the vigilance of the freeholders of the manor of Rust Hall. So you have, at this point, you have lodging houses scattered randomly across the landscape. People commented on the fact that there was no kind of organised town plan. And you have the pantals, the chalybeate springs there in that triangular fence, established as the centre for the social activities organised for the visitors. As our 1700s history tells us, Her Majesty, that's to say Henrietta Maria, was very successful in the use of the water, which greatly raised its reputation and consequently encouraged the inhabitants to exert their utmost endeavours to render this neglected place both beautiful and convenient. So that from this period, houses began to rise in the woods and gardens to overspread the forests. And as those local entrepreneurs grew in self-awareness of what they were doing, they marketed Tunbridge Wells as a romantic rural retreat, a fantasy world set apart from everyday reality, where regular social distinctions were temporarily dissolved. The water poetry, compositions by the visitors themselves, published as annual compilations, is full of Arcadian imagery harking back to classical antiquity. But to maintain that Arcadian atmosphere required the protection of green spaces and the overall rural atmosphere of the young town. And so that involved the early inhabitants of Tunbridge Wells in what we might think of as nature and habitat conservation long before such concepts were formulated in the modern sense. And both the residents and the regular visitors collaborated in this endeavour. It was regarded as axiomatic that Tunbridge Wells should retain the character of Rus in Urbi, the country and the town, as the Georgian guidebooks used to put it. Justice Brange's guidebook in 1780, from which this illustration is taken, describes a great many houses built in regular confusion and so beautifully intermixed with trees and groves that they cannot fail of having the most pleasing effect on a stranger. At a little distance, it bears the appearance of a town in the midst of woods and conveys to the imagination the soothing idea of a rural romantic retirement. And this print from Jasper's guide shows you the lodging houses on Mount Zion. They had these fanciful names for the little settlements of Tunbridge Wells. And behind it, a bit of artistic license, I'm sure, but this forest is in fact the Grove, which is a little park which was set apart for the use of visitors by the Duke of Buckingham in 1703 and conveyed to a trust of local inhabitants, and it's actually remained as a public open space ever since. Later, Paul Amsink, in his book on Tunbridge Wells, published in 1810, said this assemblage of buildings erected apparently without a plan or semblance of regularity, interspersed with trees, aided by the wild aspect of the surrounding scenery, has a striking effect on a first view, and as it presents itself from the varied points of elevated ground in the vicinity, affords an endless variety of pleasing subjects to the invalid in the pursuit of his health and to the admirer of picturesque scenery in his more extended researches. Here you're coming down the London Road from those rocks that we saw earlier, and you're looking over the young town, and that you've got the grove, the big tongue trees in the background there. And Paul Emsing's reference to visitors' researches illustrates how many of those who stayed at Tunbridge Wells like to think of themselves not just as tourists, but as scholars, as antiquarians, as naturalists, whose exploration of the surrounding countryside had a serious purpose. And guidebooks of the town catered for this perception. They included extensive historical details of the places described, as well as having appendices on topics such as botany and geology. When the Tunbridge filmy fern, seen here, was discovered at High Rocks in 1688, this definitely put Tunbridge Wells on the botanical map. And visitors were encouraged to appreciate and study its flora and fauna. What we now call the grayling butterfly, discovered about the same time, was originally called the Tunbridge grayling, because it was found either on Tunbridge Wells Common or on the nearby Broadwater Forest. And the filmy fern is still to be found in the Tunbridge Wells area up to Eridge Rocks, which is part of the Sussex Wildlife Trust Reserve that is now contiguous with RSP Broadwater Warren. The nationally important botanist and regular visitor Thomas Thurley Forster was researching the first flora of Tunbridge Wells in the 1790s, and his initial findings were published as an appendix to Justice Sprange's popular guidebook. And in 1816, Sprange collaborated with a local bookseller in publishing Forster's comprehensive Flora Tunbridgensis as a free-standing volume. In that book, Forster shows an awareness of the dangers of both habitat loss and over-collecting, which in fact put paid to the filmy fern at its original site at High Rock, so Forster survived in more secluded places. Forster writes that from the numerous new enclosures of the forests and heaths, particularly about the Broadwater Forest area, and from most of the bogs being dried up, having deep drains cut through them, many scarce plants are now lost or rarely to be found, which formerly grew in abundance. The little scarce plants, the Blasian Fusula, liverwort, which the author found in abundance 2 years ago, is gone. The lane where it grew being drained and made wider. In the above circumstances, the temperature of the air seems very much altered, for the rocks which used to produce so many scarce mosses and lichens are now so dry as hardly to produce any. Thomas Forster's son, Thomas Ignatius Maria, who lived in Tunbridge Wells at various points in his life, published a revised edition of the Flora Tunbridgensis in 1842 with a lively botanical biography of his father. There's a lovely bit where he says that he was so assiduous in his botanical expeditions that because he didn't want to lose any time at all, he'd sit off before daybreak. And he'd be there on Broadwater Forest, as the sun was coming up. But he also introduces the interesting fact that Thomas Forster was encouraged to write a companion volume on the fauna of Tunbridge Wells, which would have been a remarkable work. We had to wait something like 100 years for one, but he refused to do so, solely on conscientious grounds, stating that he had objections to the mode of making the necessary collections. He held it as a maxim that it was not justifiable to interfere with the lives and enjoyment even of insects, unless on the plea of necessity. So we never got Forster's flora of fauna of Tunbridge Wells, but he did inaugurate a great tradition of floras of Tunbridge Wells down through the following century. Edward Jenner published his Flora of Tunbridge Wells in 1845, and then local medical doctor Richard Deakin published the flowering plants of Tunbridge Wells, seen here, in 1871. And although his published works only relate to flowering plants, Deakin did also study fungi, and we have in the Amelia an amazing collection of about 1,000 or so watercolors of fungi, many of which I have so accurately drawn, and they have their data that they can actually be used for mapping today. I don't know if anybody here was involved in that, but I know I think Joyce Pitt came and looked at the catalogue cards for mapping fungi in Kent, because he's got the sections and he's got the spore bits, and he even does microfungi as well. It's incredibly ambitious in the mid 1800s. So Forster, as we said, laments the enclosure of forests and heaths on the fringes of town, like the old Broadwater Forest or Culverden Down, seen here in the mid 1800s. But there were two areas of heathland that were much more vital to the Arcadian ambience of Tunbridge Wells, and accordingly more strongly protected. And those were the 250 acres of Tunbridge Wells and Rust Hall Commons. This is the earliest map of Tunbridge Wells from 1739, surveyed by the reformed smuggler John Bower. And you can see how the peculiar shape of Tunbridge Wells Common determines the early shape of Tunbridge Wells, which grows up all around its periphery. That's Mount Zion Grove, that's the lodging house, and you've got the pantiles there. But this great sort of open space of Tunbridge Wells Common, shown there in its old name of Bishop's Down there. And local activists, as we shall see, defended the two commons very successfully against enclosure and encroachment. And they also had an awareness that these were natural habitats, that they were a wild backdrop to the town with its more formal entertainment, and that they would be spoiled if they were converted into more formal parkland, as people did sometimes suggest. Benj Burr, in his 1766 history, proposed that Tunbridge Wells Common is so happily disposed by nature that with a little industry, using clearing the ground, cutting walks, planting trees, forming vistas and other embellishments of this type, it might become one of the most agreeable places of its extent in the kingdom. Fortunately, wisdom prevailed, and the majority opinion was to keep the common as it was. The two commons were originally a working landscape. They were the wastes of the medieval manor of Rust Hall, which goes way back beyond the foundation of the town, emerging into history in the 1200s. And the wastes of the common were available to the scattered local population of freeholders or freehold tenants for grazing their animals, quarrying stone, harvesting gorse and bracken for fuel and animal bedding and other natural products, not timber, as you might think, because there's hardly any trees there at all in that early period. And in the 1730s, the freeholders won a lawsuit against the lord of the manor over compensation for loss of grazing rights over the Pantiles site, which was, Pantiles was built on the strip of the common, and the lord of the manor tried to renege on the deal that the freeholders would continue to get some of the rental income, but he failed. And the result of the lawsuit was the Landmark Rust Hall Manor Act of 1739, which protected the two commons against future infringement, and which still stands today. And from the early 1800s, the freeholders were managing the commons and celebrated for their vigilance. They were nicknamed the hog pounders for their habit of impounding unauthorized animals and locking them up until you paid your fine. So like an early version of will counting. And John Colbrand's new guide to Tunbridge Wells of 1839 describes their annual perambulation of the commons boundaries and how they execute very summary justice on those who attempt to invade their rights. They had a formal decision-making process for this, and we actually had their minute book in the Amelia. So they would decide to send out their heavies, the stewards of the manor, to remonstrate with offenders, and they would give them a time limit. You know, you take that fence down, you pull out those shrubs, or we will come down and we would do it for you. And then the stewards would report back as to whether their wishes had been complied with. If not, then they will formally authorise at their meeting, okay, we will go and knock their fence down or whatever. And Colbrand characterises the hog pounders as a body of men to whom the visitors and inhabitants of the wells are greatly indebted, inasmuch as they are the means of protecting the beautiful commons from encroachments and nuisances. This is mid-1800s, panoramic view of the common, people standing on the rocks looking out over the town there. And this is the other common, Rustall Common, with sheep being grazed and all the little ponds and the heath and vegetation there. That Georgian vision of Tunbridge Wells as a green town with abundant open spaces continued to capture people's imagination into the Victorian era. In the 1830s, when Decimus Burton was designing the Calvary New Town, developing the top part of Tunbridge Wells, the present-day town centre, he incorporates open spaces, such as what is now Calvary Grounds, into his overall plan. This is the Calvary, the villas of Calvary Park, with the private pleasure grounds which you can still walk in today, adjacent to the public Calvary Grounds. And as you go into the Victorian era, John Pelton's guidebook, published in 1871, celebrated the wild and informal nature of the commons and compared them unfavourably with green spaces in other resorts. For our modern taste, he says, its natural and wild condition renders it far more attractive than the artificial parks which it is the fashion to provide for the healthful recreation of dwellers in large cities. The furze bushes and the brake are the most noticeable ornaments. The whole expanse abounds with other plants and blossoms. Ling and heath, chamomile and thyme, milkwort and wild violets being among the most abundant. In April and May, the golden bloom of the furze, which is unusually profuse in this spot, delights the eye, and its rich perfume scents the breeze. As depicted in this postcard of about 1900 with the Wellington rocks and the gorse bushes there. And similar date panorama looking up to Mount Ephraim, the promenade, as they used to call it, fancifully comparing it to the seaside. It's very open landscape with animals still grazing as they did right up until the interwar period. The Tunbridge Wells Improvement Act of 1889, which set up the original Tunbridge Wells Borough Council, also established the Commons Conservators as a statutory body to manage them and with the powers to create bylaws. That explicitly included protecting wild plants and animals, and this is very advanced in terms of the nature of national legislation at that time. And the bylaws, as confirmed in 1892, laid down that no person shall destroy or injure any trees, bushes, gorse, heather, plants or grass on the commons. No person shall on any part of the commons take, injure or destroy any bird, or spread or use any net, set or use any snare, or other engine, instrument or means for the taking, injuring, trapping or destruction of any bird. Or displace, disturb, injure or destroy any bird's nest, or take, injure or destroy any bird's egg. No person shall shoot or chase game, pigeons or other birds or rabbits or other animals on any part of the common. No person shall take, injure, destroy, or attempt to take, injure, or destroy, or disturb, or worry, or ill-treat any fowl in any lake, pond, stream, ornamental, or other water, or elsewhere on the commons. The leaders of the new borough council were very keen on creating new open spaces for areas of the growing town beyond the centre that were not within easy reach of the commons. And the result, it's continuing into the 20th century, was our 5 historic parks. The Grove, the original Georgian park we've already mentioned. This is Grove and Hilbert Park, given by John Stonewig, the first mayor, recently subject of a Heritage Lottery bid to restore it to its original glory. This is Dunorlan, which originally started out as a private estate. It's also been an HLF bid earlier to restore the landscape there. There's St John's Park, which this is a more formal bit, but does include an area of flower-rich meadows. And Calvey Grounds, adjacent to the private Calvey Park, right in the town centre there. And bearing in mind Pelton's restrictions in that strictures in that guidebook on artificial parks in large cities, it's interesting to note that all of these public open spaces had certain areas which were managed more informally, and they preserved pre-existing habitats from the woodland wetland of flower-rich grassland, out of which they were originally taken. And I'll be telling you more about those next year. But just as a taster, this is Wildflower Meadow in County Grounds. There's bulbous buttercup from that particular period, but it's got a nice sequence of flowers which go on all through the year, so you get knapweed and other things in the high summer as well. And this complements the flower-rich grassland in the private bit just over the boundary. This is Grove and Hilbert Park, it's the wetland area with the boardwalk and some damp grasslands and the flower-rich slopes higher up there. And all supporting many flowers and insects, including one of my favourites, which is doing really well at the moment, Eucera longicornis, the amazing longhorn bee with the ridiculously extended antennae that the males have there. Continuing the story of local naturalists, this gentleman, Dr. George Abbott, not a medical doctor, big theme with medical doctors doubling up in natural history. Founded in 1885, the Tunbridge Wells Natural History Society. The president was Thomas Stebbing, fascinating gentleman, maverick clergyman, early advocate of Darwin's theory of evolution. Marine biologist, although he never went to sea, I think, but those are the specimens from the Challenger exhibition arrived at his house, which is actually on Tunbridge Wells Common, where he had at homes for the society to come and members to come and browse his collections and his library. And the Tunbridge Wells Natural History Society, which founded our museum originally, had public engagement as one of its founding objects. Establishing an educational museum was there in their constitution. And they organised a lively programme of indoor and outdoor events, with a special focus on natural history. We find in 1890, at the Society's annual meeting, George Abbott describing several excursions for the benefit of children attending the elementary schools had been arranged by some members of the Society. From 40 to 50 on each occasion have visited the forest, that's Broadwater Warren, and other open spaces in the neighbourhood. The aim had been to foster in them, during their earlier years, a love for the beautiful and to teach them to observe and revere all forms of life, whether of animals, birds, insects, or plants. And that emphasis on care for the natural world you can see in a contemporary programme card for the junior entomological section, which gives us one of its objects to protect rare species from wanton destruction. An article to the local press about orchid species found locally. George Abbott says, I withhold the names of the places where they grow, as so many are being gradually exterminated by ruthless collectors. And similarly, in a lecture to the Society on Plant Life in 1892, the President, Thomas Stebbing, criticised indiscriminate plant collecting. As a rule, he says, nothing but a daisy or dandelion was given a chance of existence by the wayside, anywhere near the habitation of human beings. It would add greatly to the common enjoyment if people would abstain from plucking and rooting up the wild plants by the roadside within and near our country towns. And if our streets and roads were allowed to become gay with wildflowers, which were respected as the common property of all. And so we owe a great debt in the Tunbridge Wells area to these early pioneers of natural history and nature conservation, because they've left to us a rich legacy of natural wildlife habitats, which we can still enjoy today. This is Tunbridge Wells Common today in all its glory, with the Capsia supporting lots of nationally scarce and rare Hymenoptera, which brings us to the end, to our tour through the early days of natural history and conservation in Tunbridge Wells. Thank you.